Chapter 2 The Party. Over the next weeks and months, Peter and James became very close. They would meet at least once a month. Sometimes they would just talk, and sometimes they wouldn't talk much, just kiss one another. James found a weeping willow in the far end of the palace grounds. This was their favourite spot as it kept them hidden from everyone else. One summer evening, they were laying beneath the weeping willow. Peter had his arm around James and was watching the sunlight dancing through the swaying willow tree. James had his eyes closed, but began talking. "Don't you just love this weather, especially under the shade of this tree?" he asked. "Yes, it's lovely," Peter replied, and took in a big breath of the fresh air. "Here," Peter said, reaching into his pocket. "I have something I want to give you." They both rolled over onto their stomachs and sat up on their elbows. Peter opened his hand to reveal a silver pearl. Before James could take it, he closed his hand again. "But before you can have it, you have to answer a question," Peter said. "I hope it's not a history question. I was never good at that," James replied. Peter laughed. No, he said. "It's not." He cleared his throat. "The question is," he paused, "I love you. Do you love me?" Peter asked. There was a few moments where all was quiet. The only sounds were the willow branches swaying and birds singing nearby. James kept his eye on Peter and reached out to Peter's hand, opened the hand holding the pearl, and slid his hand into it so the pearl was between their palms. "Of course I love you too," James said, and kissed Peter. With his free hand, Peter touched James's face, then slid his hand round the back of his head, James's soft hair brushing on his fingers. When they broke away, Peter kept his palm open for James to take the pearl. "I was given that by a fisherman when I was 10, Peter told James. "My father told me not to talk to fishermen, as they are peasants. I kept the pearl secretly. The fisherman told me it was treasure from a mermaid, but I see them round many wealthy women's necks. So I want to give this to you, my secret pearl to my secret love." James was touched. "I will treasure it," James said, and he put it in his pocket. They kissed again. It had been a week since Peter had given his gift to James. James wanted to give a gift to Peter too, but had so little money. Luckily, he came up with the perfect idea. Peter waited in the garden for James to show up. Sometimes James showed up immediately, sometimes he took a while. It always depended on what jobs he had to do that day, and anybody who might be out in the garden. Peter was by the water fountain, as nobody was nearby. James arrived shortly. "I have something for you," James said, taking Peter by the hand. He walked with him round to the small garden outside Peter's window. James made Peter stand next to a dug-up area of ground. "Wait here," James said, with a big smile on his face. He went and picked something up from the far side of the small garden and returned with a plant. The plant had dark green leaves and thorns along the stems. "A rosebush," James told the prince. "It is a gift for you, from me." Peter smiled and a tear came to his eye. "It's lovely." James blinked. "There's no flowers on it yet," he said in response. "I meant the gift," Peter said, "although I'm sure the roses will be lovely too." He watched on as James planted the rosebush. "I'll be able to see this from my window," Peter said, looking up to the windows of his chambers. James stood up. "Which one is yours?" he asked, looking up too. "From there," he pointed to one window, "to there." He pointed at the window far along from the first. "Wow, that's a large room," James breathed. "Look." They both turned back to the rosebush. "Every time it flowers, you can remember how much I love you. The flowers are my present for you." James took hold of Peter's hand, and they gazed towards the rosebush. It was time for the king's annual Christmas feast, a celebration that Peter truly hated. Everyone of a high status from everywhere in the land would attend, and it wasn't just a few hours like most events that his father held. It went on from evening until dawn. Peter was sat in his bed the morning of the celebration, worrying about the event, when he had a fantastic idea. It was much too early for his mother and father to be up, but he knew a good number of servants and lower-class members of the palace would be awake and working. The prince put on a simple shirt and a pair of trousers, threw an old robe over the top to keep warm, and took a fancy set of clothes with him to the gardens. He didn't have to look long to find a weary-looking James starting off his work for the day. "James," Peter said quietly from nearby. James turned, surprised to see Peter at all, let alone so early in the morning. "Peter, what are you doing here?" he asked, creeping over to him. "I had a wonderful idea," James listened. "You see, since my father is throwing the annual grand Christmas feast tonight, there'll be so many people that nobody will know who is who, even my own father." James nodded, not sure where the plan was going. "So, I could sneak you in without anyone knowing." James was surprised. I'm not sure that's a good idea," James said anxiously. "Why not?" Peter asked, upset. "What if someone was to recognize me as the palace gardener?" he said. Peter looked at him. "I'm not saying this to put you down, but has anyone other than me actually looked at you properly?" Peter asked. James thought for a moment. "You make a good point," he said with a small smile. "But how will I fit in?" he asked. "Ah, see here." Peter held out the fancy clothes he had brought with him. "I've never worn these, so nobody will recognize them as mine, and you'll fit right in. You can change into them in the small garden, and I'll meet you by the rose bush. Nobody will be using that entrance, so you can sneak in unnoticed." James smiled. "This is so exciting," he said. "And we get to spend more time together. But you'll have to leave before the feast, otherwise my father will notice, when you'd be left without a seat. But there are still plenty of hours before we eat." James asked Peter to bring the clothes back for him in the evening, as he didn't have anywhere to keep them without going back to his room. So the plan was set. Peter would sneak James into his father's Christmas celebration. Lords and ladies, dames and dukes, barons and knights, all made their way into the palace for the grand celebration. Peter was in his chamber getting ready. He was wearing some of his most expensive clothing, and had been told by his father to wear his royal robe and crown. He did not mind the robe in winter, but he always felt embarrassed to wear his crown. He felt as if it was showing off his royal status. He wore the crown nonetheless. James had made his way to the small garden and waited for Peter to arrive. Peter spotted James from his window. James heard a noise and looked up. It was Peter opening one of the windows. He smiled at James, then held the clothes out for James to try and catch. He caught them, and Peter said quietly that he would be down shortly. By the time Peter had arrived in the garden, James was changed into the smart clothes. Peter fixed James's lavalier, which was not on correctly. "You look beautiful," Peter said to James. "Like you can say anything," James said back. "You're stunning." Peter blushed. "The robe and crown are not my choice," Peter told him. "I don't mind them," James said, and leaned in for a kiss. Peter gave him a quick kiss. "Don't want to risk anyone seeing us," he said. "Let's go in." James followed Peter inside. As they neared the ballroom, they could both hear the buzz of people and the music being played by the musicians hired by the king. Peter and James walked through the door to the ballroom. James had to try with all his might not to be astounded by all he was seeing. It was the largest room he had ever seen. The ceiling was painted with glorious scenes of saints, cherubs, and angels. The windows were bigger than most rooms he'd seen, and the number of portraits on the walls was breathtaking. "Try not to freak out," Peter spoke as he ushered James in front of him. James swallowed and tried to keep his composure. The night went well. James and Peter were able to talk to one another without worrying about being caught. Peter didn't even mind so much when people came up to talk to him, since he had James by his side. Nobody asked who James was, assuming he was a child of one of the guests, which was a relief for both he and Peter, who didn't have a solid answer to give if anyone did ask. After a couple of hours, at around 10 o'clock, James asked where the toilet was. Peter walked him down a corridor that had guests mingling in it. James followed Peter through a lovely carved door into the latrine. "Wow," James said as he entered the room. There was no one else in there, so he could finally express his excitement of the room. "This is a toilet area? It's nicer than where I sleep," he exclaimed. "There's all these tiles on the walls and a stained glass window. Oh, and look at these carved doors," he said, touching the doors to the toilet stall. "Even the toilets look gorgeous." He looked at the lovely blue-coloured toilet, almost like it was too good to use. Peter smiled and giggled. He loved how excited James seemed about the latrine. James used the toilet, then washed his hands. "This is nicer than anything I've ever been used to," he told Peter. Peter nodded. "I wish I could see this from your perspective," Peter said, leaning against the windowsill. "Really?" James asked. "Do you not feel happy having all of this at your fingertips?" "I think I would if I hadn't always had it," Peter said. "But I've never known anything else." "I suppose that makes sense. I haven't known much else other than my dull bed and shared room for a long time," James said. "Didn't you tell me you used to live in a cottage with your father?" Peter asked. "Oh yes. I don't remember much though, as I was small. But I know it was in the countryside. We had a vegetable patch and a big flower bed and a cat that kept mice out. My father told me the roof was thatched and ivy grew up the walls." James looked as if he were far away, in a dreamland. "Sounds perfect," Peter said. James snapped out of his dream. "Compared to this?" he asked. "Definitely," Peter said. "I would love to live in a little cozy home with loving parents, or parent," he corrected, "than live here in a big cold room and only seeing my parents every now and then." Peter pushed himself up off the windowsill to stand closer to James. "It was a lovely place," James said. "However," he continued and took Peter's hands in his, "if I hadn't left, I wouldn't be here with you," he told him. Peter took James's face in his hands and pulled him in for a kiss. James's hands rested on Peter's shoulders. Just at that moment, the door opened. Both James and Peter gasped and looked to see who was stood in the doorway. A surprised-looking fellow, only a couple of years older than Peter and James, had paused in the doorway. He said, I'm sorry," and backed out of the door, which swung closed. Peter and James turned to each other with worried faces. "You should go after him," James urged. Peter nodded quickly and ran out of the door, hitting his hand on the way out. He ran in front of the young man, so they were facing each other, and touched him on the arm to stop him from walking away. "Please," Peter said. "I know it looks bad, but—" He didn't have an excuse. "Hey," said the young man, who Peter had realized was his cousin. "I wasn't meant to see that. I understand." He tried to reassure Peter. Peter looked up at him. "Please don't tell anybody. My father would kill me if he knew about this," he pleaded. Peter's cousin put his hand on Peter's arm. "I won't say a word. It's forgotten," he assured. Peter smiled thankfully and began to walk back. "Although, a word of advice," said the cousin. Peter turned. "Maybe don't do anything you don't want to be seen in a place people are likely to use." Peter nodded, and then walked off in the opposite direction. Peter returned to the latrine, but it was empty. "James?" he called. He realized James must have left, and Peter went back to the ballroom for an hour, before the guests headed to the banquet hall to feast. Peter was wearily walking back to his room, his mother and father walking with him. The sun was starting to rise, and Peter was desperate to get some sleep. "Be up by midday, and we will eat together," King Harold told Peter. Christmas Eve. Peter saw it as a strange day in between two major events, his father's big Christmas celebration and Christmas Day. He nodded to his father and walked into his bedchamber. He placed his crown on the table, took off his robe, and draped it over the back of the chair, and he began to take his shirt off, gazing out of the window, when he spotted movement in the garden. Looking closer, he realized it was James, holding the clothes he had been wearing at the party. He had folded them neatly, ready to hand back. Peter waved to him and opened the window, a chilly breeze hitting his face.
"Leave them under the rosebush and I'll collect them later,"
Peter called to James. James nodded and did so, then blew a kiss to Peter. Peter smiled and closed the window. He then put on his bedclothes, got into bed, and fell asleep. Christmas Day, the one day of the year where King Harold insisted that he, Queen Lillian, and Peter spend all day together. Peter was not a fan of this. He would much prefer to be alone than spend a whole day with his parents. His father was too arrogant, and he saw his mum as mousy. She was always very quiet and timid when she was with Peter's father. He felt like she never said what she was thinking in the presence of the king. Peter had taught himself to grin and bear it, but this year was different. This year he had someone he wanted to spend time with. He had spent the whole time they were eating their Christmas dinner with a number of royal family members, thinking of ways he could sneak off for a while without anybody, particularly his father, noticing. It was mid-afternoon, and Peter saw his father talking to an uncle of Peter's. He took the opportunity to sneak away. He casually left the room as if he was leaving to go to the latrine, and walked all the way to the servants' quarters. He had never ventured further than the kitchen before, so didn't know where he was going, or where to find James. He first found himself in the pantry, where there was bread dough proving in a dish on a wooden table. Then he realised he'd gone back on himself when he walked past a painting of some creepy children for the second time. He then found himself in the kitchen, wondering how he had bypassed it on his way, where the staff all bowed low in an excited greeting. "Oh, you don't have to do that," Peter said. The staff stood back up. "What brings you down here, Your Highness?" asked the chief cook. Peter thought on the spot. "Oh, I came to thank you all for the wonderful meal and wish you all a Merry Christmas." A chorus of Merry Christmases came back at him. "May I ask you where the sleeping quarters are?" The main cook pointed him down a long hallway. He thanked her and carried on. He approached a door that he believed to be the correct one. He knocked on it and waited. A young lady opened it, astounded to see the prince standing there. "Your Highness," she said, then curtsied ungracefully. Peter blushed. "I apologize," he said. "I was looking for the men's sleeping quarters." She told him where they were, and as she was going back in, he turned and said, "Merry Christmas." She and a group of girls which had excitedly gathered in the doorway giggled with excitement and closed the door. The door to the men's sleeping quarters was open. Peter poked his head round. He saw there was only around 5 people in the room that had 30 beds in it. He was shocked at how many people had to sleep in the one room. "Oh my!" he heard from a man across the room. "Your Highness!" he said and bowed. The other men in the room all turned to the doorway to see Peter, including James, who was in there. They all bowed, apart from James. "Please, you don't need to do that," Peter told them. He wasn't sure how to explain why he was in there, when suddenly he found a distraction. "Oh wow, it's snowing!" he said, and rushed to the window with everyone else. Everybody was excited by the snowfall. James had an idea. "We should all go out in the snow," James told everyone. They all agreed and left the room with their jackets. James and Peter stayed behind. Once they were alone and knew nobody could see them, Peter pulled James in by the waist and kissed him gently. "I can't stay long, otherwise they'll realize I left. But I had to come see you," Peter told James, then reached into his pocket. "And give you this." He held a small brooch with a rose embellishment. "Oh, it's lovely," James said, taking the gift. "I don't have anything for you," James said. "That doesn't matter. I wasn't expecting anything in return," he replied. "Can I show you something, though, before you go?" Peter nodded. "Of course." James took his hand and walked him over to the bed. They both sat on the bed, and James picked up a frame. "This is my father." He handed the frame to Peter. A black and white photograph of a middle-aged man was in the frame. "It was taken around 10 years ago," James said. "I can't tell if he's familiar because I remember seeing him, or because he looks similar to you," Peter said. James smiled and placed a small photograph over the picture of his father. "This is both of them," James told Peter. Peter picked up the small photo and looked. It was a sepia photo of a man and woman in wedding attire. The woman in her bridal gown, and the man in a suit and tie. They both looked happy. "They look lovely," Peter said. James nodded. "That's the only photo they could ever afford. And the one of my father was paid for by a family friend." "Do you have one of you?" Peter asked. "No, I don't." "Why?" James replied. "I would love a photo of you." Then he smiled. "I could persuade my father to get photos taken of all of you." "But how would you get one?" James asked. "I would say he should give a copy to each of you to send to family." "Oh, and I give it to you?" Peter nodded. "That's a good idea. But will your father really do it?" he asked. "If I stroke his ego enough, I'm sure I can talk him into it," Peter said. He stood up. "I should get back." James stood up too and pulled Peter in for one last kiss. "If I could, I would stay with you all day," Peter whispered and squeezed James's hand. James saw Peter to the door and watched him head off. He then picked up his own jacket and joined his colleagues outside in the snow. A few days had passed since Christmas Day. Peter decided to take the opportunity to ask his father about taking photos of the staff. He found his father in the blue room, playing solitaire. "Father," Peter started, "I wanted to ask you something." Peter sat down on a large chair. King Harold didn't look up from his game, but made a noise to show he was listening. "I wondered if it might be a good idea to have photographs taken of all the staff that work here," Peter said, and waited anxiously for the reaction. King Harold stopped his game and put the cards in his hand down on the table. "Why on earth should I do that?" King Harold asked. "Well, because you would then know who was working for you with pictures," Peter began. "And I thought it would be a lovely gesture to give them a copy that they could send to their families." King Harold looked offended. "What is wrong with you, boy? Why should I care about lowlifes and their families?" he scoffed. "But father," Peter leaned closer, "if you do this, they will be so thankful, as will their families." The king glanced towards Peter. "Just think, some of them won't have seen their families for years. If I was away, wouldn't you be happy to see a photo of me?" he asked. "Well, yes," the king said. "It would be a lovely start to the new year, and they would be forever grateful to you," Peter added, hoping that would persuade the king. King Harold sighed. "I'll see what I can do." He looked at Peter. "But I will be taking the credit." "That's fine," Peter said. "I wasn't looking for recognition." He left the blue room, and King Harold continued his card game. King Harold did bring in a photographer to take photographs of all his staff members. He sat in the room all afternoon as the photography was taking place. Most staff members were excited to see a camera for the first time, and many even smiled for the whole time while the photo was being captured. James smiled, thinking of Peter, and was excited to give his copy to him once he received it. The king didn't care for the staff to be happy, although he sat in the room all day to remind them that it was his grand idea for this privilege. Once all the staff had their photos taken and gone back to their work, the photographer asked the king, "Would you like your photograph taken, Your Majesty?" He agreed, but called for Lillian and Peter to come have a family photograph. The photographer was about to leave when he said, "It's a great thing to do, Your Majesty. Many men wouldn't think of doing something so lovely for their servants. I think it's brilliant." The king smiled. "Thank you. I try to consider my staff's needs," he lied. "You are a good king," the photographer said. King Harold was finally happy he had made the decision.